everyone. Welcome to Paint Branch Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm glad you've been able to come join with us this morning. We're going to start now. I'm going to begin by muting everyone. So right now I'm muting everyone. And make sure I'm still not muted. And we will have our music director, David Chapman, begin us with a version of Sister Suffragette from Mary Poppins. David?
Good morning. Welcome to Paint Branch Unitarian Universalist Church. We're joyful to be here together. We hope that everyone is staying safe in our days of social distancing. Wherever you are on your spiritual journey, wherever your ancestors came from, whatever your race, age, gender, sexual identity, identification, or political affiliation, whatever device you're being piped in on, we are glad that you chose to join this congregation this morning. I am Polly Pettit, one of 7 worship associates who plan services in collaboration with the minister and the church staff. If you are Zooming this morning, please run your cursor around the perimeter of your screen to find the microphone icon, and be sure to remain muted throughout the service so that we can all hear the speakers and David's piano. You may also find the option for switching between gallery view and speaker view. I believe you will want to choose speaker view, particularly during the images of suffrage segment, so that you can see the pictures very well. Clicking on the bubble icon opens up the chat screen where you can read timely messages during the service from our Assistant Church Administrator, Phil Brown. Right now, I invite you to type into chat how many people are viewing from your screen. Please type 1 if it's just you. Later in the service, you'll be invited to use the chat feature to post your joys and sorrows. If you're new to worshiping here, please post your name and contact information in chat so that we can contact you later, since we cannot reach you in a physical space as we normally would. You'll have the option of joining a small chat group when the service is over by staying on Zoom. Rachel?
Was that your handoff to me, Polly? Because I was distracted. My name is Reverend Rachel Christensen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with you today from Pittsfield, Massachusetts to help celebrate this brand new baby. And this is Tycho, who is 2 weeks old this morning. And he's still not due until another week. So we have been delighted in this, and he's happy to say hello to all of you this morning. I'm going to hand him back to his dad. So welcome to Paint Branch. I'm the minister at Paint Branch Unitarian Universalist Church, and I'm glad you're with us today. The music that David played this morning was Sister Suffragette from Mary Poppins. And suffragette was a term that was given to, it's really called suffragists, but suffragette was a term that was given to the group by newspapers who were really belittling the work that they were doing. And so it was intended as a ridicule. And the group took it on as a banner, as a mark of pride. Yes, we are the suffragettes. So it's a way to take an accusation and turn it into their own, claim the name, be proud, be full on suffragettes in their work in England to get the vote for women. So today we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment, granting women in this country the right to vote. That anniversary is actually, I think, August 18, just a few days from now. Polly will tell us for real, so she's got that in her remarks, but we're delighted to be with you today. Thank you. Please join us now in our chalice lighting. Polly?
As I light the chalice, please join me in the words on your screen. Oh boy, here we go. We light the chalice to celebrate Unitarian Universalism. This is the church of the open mind, the helping hands, the loving heart, and the radiant spirit. Encendamos este caliz para celebrar el Unitarismo Universalismo. Esta es la iglesia de la mente abierta, de las manos amigas, del amor del corazón y del espíritu radiante. Rachel?
Yep, there we go. So this morning, I think about that story about how the suffragists in England took a term that was intended to criticize and ridicule them and turned it into a rallying cry, a strength. When my kids were little, we had a book we read that was about bullies of a younger, smaller boy. And the boys on the bus called him a twerp. I don't know if that's a word we hear much anymore or if the kids today are hearing, but it was intended as a bullying word. And they teased him on the bus every week. And his older brother tried to help him to figure out what to do about these kids that were being mean, but nobody had the right approach or the approach that would work for this young boy. And then one day he had an idea. And he took one of his t-shirts and he took a piece of fabric and pinned it to the shoulders of his t-shirt. And he made like a cape on the back of his t-shirt. And on the back of it, he had drawn a picture and some words. And the picture and the words said, "Super twerp." So he claimed that word that was meant to make him feel small, that was meant to belittle him, that was meant to make him feel embarrassed and shamed. And instead he took it to empower himself. He showed up at the bus and he said, "I'm super twerp." And you know, those boys never teased him again. They became his friends. They knew that he was creative and strong and independent and capable. The same was true for the suffragettes. Their name was suffragist, a person working for suffrage. Oh, that's a whole thing. This funny big word of suffrage means vote. So these were women who did not have the right to vote in their lives, to help make decisions that affected their lives. And so their work was women's suffrage, women's vote, the vote for women. And the work they did were as suffragists. But in England, like I said, they named them the suffragettes, which was intended to make them small and foolish and embarrassed and worthless and powerless. And instead they claimed it and said, we are super twerp. We are super suffragists. And they claimed it and ran with it. And that carried them through a very difficult and very powerful process of earning the right to vote. Thank you. We are now going to have the opportunity to see pictures of some of these women and the work they did, not in England, but in this country, in the work that they did to gain the right to vote for women in the United States of America. These pictures are from 1850 maybe through 1920, when the right to vote was finally granted. Images of suffrage, of the work they did to claim suffrage.
was 22 when I first took my trip to the ballot box. I admit I was not thinking of Carrie Chapman Catt or Alice Paul. That year, I'd started my first job out of college as the secretary for the newly opened Office of Affirmative Action for Women at the University of Kansas, where I had just graduated. The late 60s and early 70s had created a new wave of consciousness surrounding women's rights. Issues such as equality against women, childcare moved to the forefront. This came to be known as the second wave of feminism, the first wave being the suffragists who fought for our right to vote. My office existed only because a brave group of 30 faculty and staff women, known as the February Sisters, occupied a building on campus in order to put a federally mandated affirmative action plan into place. I suspect that I landed the job definitely not for my typing skills, but because my boss thought she could nurture me into a true feminist. And she succeeded. It was exciting to be part of efforts to hire and promote more women in the faculty and staff, get them paid fairly, to see women athletes expand their programs, to get more female students into math and science. I was introduced to a group of women active in local politics, and they became my lifelong sisters. I'll never forget the excitement of going to the National Women's Political Caucus Convention and hearing Gloria Steinem speak. Bella Abzug was making waves in Congress, and Shirley Chisholm was the first woman to compete for the presidential nomination on the Democratic Party ticket. I was looking forward not at feminists who had come before me. The women's suffrage movement of the first wave felt like ancient history. Wasn't the vote for women inevitable in 1920? No, history never is. I was not aware that it was 72 years between the first convention for women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York, and the final ratification in 1920. I didn't know that there were two distinct factions of the movement, the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Woman's Party, who were bitterly opposed to each other's tactics, not even civil enough to be in the same room for the momentous signing into law. That there were well-organized Black women suffragists who were constantly pushed into the background so that white supremacists needed for the vote wouldn't feel threatened. That women in the anti-suffrage forces believed they had a privileged position in motherhood, and voting by women was against God's will, and suffragists were communists and Bolsheviks. I was not aware of the incredible political acumen and iron will of both factions of the movement to finally push the amendment over the line. That women had been jailed and sometimes force-fed during hunger strikes. I admit that I took my ability to vote for granted. In the early 1970s, I felt that women's issues were gaining national attention for the first time. Our time had finally come. But just as in the first wave, there was divisiveness within the movement and among women in general. The second wave was seen as mostly white and middle class, not addressing issues of less privileged women. One of the mothers of the modern women's movement, Betty Friedan, refused to show solidarity with lesbians or address gender issues. Similar to opponents of women's suffrage, Phyllis Schlafly fought the Equal Rights Amendment, predicting that certain destruction of the family and condemning feminists as man-haters and communists. American women won the vote in 1920. They did it through fearlessness, sacrifice, and iron determination, and perhaps by pressuring men in power from two diametrically opposed strategies. Although many of the inequities in society that the Suffs wanted to change still plague us today, those women pushed open the door to the room where it happens. They made my life better by giving me a political voice. It's my responsibility to keep up the fight. On Election Day in 2016, I thought of Esther Nichols, 98 years old and always active in this church and in the League of Women Voters. On that day, I was sure that Esther, who had been born before American women were granted the right to vote, would see a woman elected president. It didn't happen. But I need to keep going to the polls, working for change, and paying respect to our foremothers. We may not have seen a woman president elected in 2016, but we have the chance to elect a woman of color to the second highest office in the country this November. I think the early Suffs would be pleased. And now let us join our hearts and minds in a time of prayer and meditation. As we gather in community, we carry with us our pain and our joy. Sometimes sharing these joys and sorrows in community can help. You're now welcome to share your written joys and sorrows by typing them into the chat bar. During the intonation, we'll hear David play Maple Leaf Rag, composed by Scott Joplin. Thank you, David. Let us take a moment to acknowledge all that has been shared, as well as those joys and sorrows that remain unspoken and yet are in our minds and hearts. May we hold these and one another in love and kindness, so this congregation may be a source of strength and comfort, courage and hope in these days and weeks to come.
Thank you, David and Polly. Sally Roche Wagner, a historian, said in the New York Times, quote, "I think as a culture, we are really grappling with what I call the both and of our historic figures? How do we both hold accountability and celebrate? The suffragists both did this passionate, incredibly important creation of democracy, which we didn't have before, and they also need to be held accountable for furthering racist laws. This is a story of both and. Finally adopted in 1920, when Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment, the work took decades, 7 decades. Several key women worked all their lives on passing the amendment and never saw it ratified. For many of them, their daughters took up the work and saw it carried through. In July of 1848, imagine that, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met with Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin Wright, and Mary McClintock, and they planned a meeting of women to take place later that month. They first wrote their own Declaration of Independence for Women, stating that all men and women are created equal and calling for women's rights. In just a few weeks, they gathered 300 women, and men were allowed to attend on the second day. There were speeches, including one by Frederick Douglass. 11 resolutions were passed, including one calling for the women's right to vote. It was a radical position, a radical statement, and not universally supported, even at this convention. But upon marriage, women relinquished their property, their money, their control over their lives, assigning those instead to their husbands and then to their sons. At the convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, quote, "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love," unquote. It was over 70 years before the right to vote for women would become a national right. The names involved in the movement include many women, some of whom were shown in the slideshow. Over the decades, their children took up the effort. Some of the women were as follows: Susan B. Anthony, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Mary Church Terrell, Native American Sarah Winnemucca, Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, and many, many others. The strategy and the politics shifted and changed over the decades. They worked locally, nationally, within the states, within the Congress, seeking to enact laws, elect people favorable to the vote, change people's minds, demonstrate, march, write, teach, and lobby. Frederick Douglass said in 1857, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both," unquote. It's the second half of that quote that is rare, is not heard as often. And I think it plays a key role in this story of women's suffrage. Power was held by white men, and the women in the movement worked hard to figure out how to truly make their demand. Initially, most of the women leaders were involved in the abolitionist movement. Some were involved in the Underground Railroad and in personal testimony against slavery. During and after the Civil War, the work on women's suffrage and women's rights ebbed as the work to end slavery took priority. However, when the 15th Amendment was proposed to grant Black men the right to vote, some of the women in the suffrage movement actively opposed it. They saw it as the opportunity to enact true universal suffrage. In addition, they felt there was a higher priority for granting women the right to vote. They proclaimed that educated women, white women, women of culture and privilege should vote, and that their vote was more important and more advantageous for the country than the votes of those who were former slaves. Later in the 19th century, there was strong alignment with the growing temperance movement. Too many men, and always men, were too frequently drinking and spending the money that could have been used to provide food and housing and clothing for children and families. The movement blamed the ready availability of alcohol for the poverty and poor conditions of families. Thousands of women all over the country joined the temperance movement to end drunkenness and its impact on families. But when they aligned the effort to gain the vote with the temperance movement, what happened? The saloon lobby and the liquor companies worked against the right to vote. They successfully argued to the voters, men, that if the women were granted the right to vote, then the men would lose their access to the liquor. It worked every time. Women were already organized in many ways, in clubs and charity and church work. In the early 20th century, the movement aligned with these organized groups at various times over the years. And Black women were highly organized. Many were interested in working on the suffrage movement. They could have brought so much in the way of presence, activists, people, numbers to the movement. But the white women in the suffrage movement generally rebuffed their offers. The South had been effective in eliminating the vote of Black population through Jim Crow laws. And they, the South, were strongly opposed to bringing women, Black women, into the voting public because it would shift the power dynamic in the Southern states. White women in the voting movement were afraid that if Black women were visible in the suffrage movement, it would galvanize the Southern powers against the amendment. Even someone such as Ida B. Wells, who was a very well-known, visible anti-lynching activist, writer, and reporter, she was rebuffed by the movement and told she could not march in a public suffrage march. She came out of the crowd on that day into the street to join the Illinois delegation in spite of the resistance by the organizers. She was going to be part of that, and you're not going to keep me out. For a time, the organizers focused on gaining the vote state by state, and several Western states did in fact grant full or partial voting privileges to women. And in fact, the world didn't fall apart. But it was a state by state effort. And the concern was they would never gather the right to vote in every state by going about it that way. Eventually, they decided the only way to do it was to go to a federal constitutional amendment. And so this is a story of a single focus on the vote for women over 70 years of effort and a parade of competing issues and demands. The activists saw the women's vote being sidelined again and again in favor of other issues, and the leaders felt that their cause might never be granted. There was a more radical arm of the suffrage movement in the person of Alice Paul. Alice Paul had been in London as a graduate student when the radical and sometimes violent suffrage protests were going on there in order to gain the women's right to vote in England. She worked side by side with Emmeline Pankhurst and the rest of the Pankhurst family and the radical suffragette movement there. When Alice Paul returned to this country in 1910, she began organizing women with a more aggressive approach. They engaged in major marches of thousands of women. They picketed the White House day after day, winter and summer. They picketed the president. They marched, blocked traffic, and eventually got arrested. They stopped the president's car, demanded to speak with him. They shamed the president and his administration with signs when foreign leaders were visiting. When Alice Paul was arrested in 1917, she and several of the other women began a hunger strike in prison. The prison put them in solitary confinement and forced fed them 3 times each day. The newspaper publicized their actions and their abuse, and the public outcry led to their early release. As Frederick Douglass said, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the measure of injustice which will be imposed on them. They will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. Alice Paul and her compatriots were no longer willing to quietly submit to the injustice. They had figured out a stepped up form of demand, beyond words, beyond lobbying, beyond persuasion. And it was only after the radical actions of Alice Paul and the hunger strikes, only after the Temperance Amendment was actually passed in 1919 and the liquor lobby was now unimportant, only after the election of more supportive people into Congress, only after the election of people from states that had already been granted the right to vote, only after the end of World War I, only then in the spring of 1920 would Congress muster enough votes to pass the amendment. And then the race was on to get states to ratify it. Divisiveness, changing strategies, shifting leadership, alliances formed and broken, shutting out of potential allies. This is the stuff of history. It was messy and difficult, racist, and in some ways offensive, classist, and ugly. And for 70 years, they worked and planned and organized and tried and lobbied. The work was prologue, and they built an organization that was ready when the forces in the world seemed to align to allow passage of the amendment to occur. When the moment in history arrived that was favorable to passage of the amendment, hundreds of thousands of women showed up to bring it into reality. Kate Clark LeMay, a historian and curator, said, "This is not a boring history of nagging spinsters. It is a badass history of revolution, staged by political geniuses. I think that because they were women, people have hesitated to credit them as such." The work is hard, and success is not guaranteed. There was no assurance that the women could convince men to concede the power of the vote. Margaret Morrison said her parents were living in Memphis when the 19th Amendment was ratified, but it made no difference to their ability to vote. Very few Black women or men were able to vote in Memphis because of the Jim Crow laws. Only those with significant influence or connection could register to vote. Her parents were only first able to vote after the passage of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. However, her aunt, Vivian Johnson, lived in Baltimore, and she was able to register and vote after the 19th Amendment. She was born in 1889, an active member of the National Council of Negro Women, the group founded by Mary McLeod Bethune. But they had not been part of the activism to bring about the passage of women's suffrage. The women activists did not encourage Black women's involvement because they didn't want to stir up opposition by Southern whites. As Sally Roche Wagner said, how do we both hold accountability and celebrate? The suffragists did this passionate, incredibly important expansion of democracy, which we didn't have before. And they engaged in racist, divisive politicking. Let us find a way to celebrate the work they did and mourn and name and learn from the way they diminished people of color, people of lesser class, or of poor education. What could our world be like now if we remember and act with inclusion in the work today? Because the work is ongoing, and we can look to the 70 years of activism by the first wave of feminism as one reminder of persistence, consistent goals, and final accomplishment of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Success was not and never is guaranteed. It is not assured that the arc of history bends towards justice. It takes marches and arrests and national press. It takes radical action and political pressure. It may take years or decades for change to come, and even now, the work is not yet done. Each change may bring some progress, some relief, some aid for some, but the work is not yet done. The vote is not guaranteed. There are threats to the right to vote every day in this place and time. Power concedes nothing without demand. The people in power were and continue to be steadfast in not conceding power. The ongoing effort is much about determining the pressure points, the actions that can result in pushing people to relinquish power. Finding that place, that action, that public position that changes the tide to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. May we work and continue to work toward protecting and assuring the right to vote in honor of the remarkable effort and sacrifice of these women of our history. May we do them honor and work to extend that right and privilege and access to all to vote, to participate in the governance of our country. May it be so. I'm pretty sure I was supposed to announce this.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building
The mission of this church carries on in these uncertain times and is more important than ever. We are so grateful to have the financial support of friends and members like you. Please give as generously as you are able. This Sunday's offering can be received as indicated in the chat bar. You can make online donations through Breeze or by text, and you can still mail donations to the church office. David will now play I Am Woman by Helen Reddy and Ray Burton.
Thank you, David. Thank you for being thoughtful with us today about this anniversary, about the issue of the vote, about the need to protect it. Many of you have seen in the chat that Pat Bahena is working with others across the country on UU the Vote. And she is working on sending postcards to folks in North Carolina who may have been removed from the voter rolls. She invites you to help and let her know. Some of you have done so on the chat, but I encourage you to send her an email, Pat Bahena, or send it to me if you can't find her email, and I'll forward it to Pat. If you are available to help out with some postcards, I think they're sending them out near the end of the month. We're grateful you joined us today. We will have breakout rooms after the service. There'll be a video just before the breakout rooms, and then we'll give you an invitation. And we invite you to stay in the main room with Polly, Pettit, and me to talk more about the history of the women's suffrage movement, or wherever that conversation leads you. May you be well. May you be strong. May you be healing. And together in this time of pandemic, as we continue to figure out how to work toward greater justice, community, and continuity. Please join together now as we sing Spirit of Life, Fuente de Amor. The words will be projected on the screen. Thank you.
I'll extinguish the chalice for today. Please stay and enjoy the closing video, My Vote, My Voice, My Right, by Melanie Harvey and Roy Zimmerman, performed by One City Chorus of St. Petersburg, Florida.
Way back when they said all men, they meant every wealthy European male.
Way back then, to vote required being white and being rich and being male. They said you can't vote
if you don't own property.
You can't vote
if you're not free.
You can't vote if you are a woman, 'cause you've got no stake in democracy.
Year by year, people had to ponder what the Declaration must amend. By all men, clearly it was time for an electoral adjustment. And they won the vote for those who had no property, won the vote for those who lived free, won the vote for women in America. They wrote it down, it was guaranteed. They all said it's my vote, you can't deny it. My voice can't take it away. My right, I won't be quiet. It's my vote, my voice, my right. My vote, my voice, my right.
Well, a right's a right, but without a fight it can evaporate and float away.
And by night there were those who came around and tried to take the vote away, saying
You can't vote,
You haven't paid the poll tax,
you can't vote,
you can't pass the exam,
you can't vote.
for fear of retribution.
And the people stood up and said, well, damn, it's my vote, you can't deny it. My voice can't take it away. My right, I won't be quiet. It's my vote, my voice, my right. My vote, my voice, my right. So, my friends, get to know your candidates and register and rock the vote. And beware, always in the shadows there are those who want to block the vote. saying you can't vote, you registered improperly, you can't vote, the lines are too long, you can't vote, the machine isn't working right, you can't vote, you've been purged from the rolls, say you're gonna use it, say you'll never lose it, and if they ask you whose it is, just say it's my vote, my voice, my right, my vote, my voice, my right, my vote, my voice, my right, it's my vote, you can't deny it, my voice can't take it away, my right, I won't be quiet, I won't be quiet, I won't be quiet, it's my vote, my vote, my voice, my voice, my right